name is Marlies Rikken. I'm one of the editors, and I will be your host and moderator for today's webinar. The co-editors are listed on the slide that you see before you. As most of you know, the MyData Operator thematic group published the Understanding MyData Operators white paper only last month on the 29th of April. This paper focuses on practical aspects of technology and governance to make the operation of infrastructures for personal data easier and more human-centric, with the final goal of establishing full interoperability for operators. Now, that's quite a mouthful, and what that exactly means will be explained to you by the main editors, Joost Langford, Antti Poikula, and Will Janssen. They will present the paper to you today and answer any questions you may have. So before we dive in, I have a few words about the practicalities of this hour. We will be taking about 40 minutes to present the paper, after which we will have a 15-minute Q&A, where we will speak more generally about the topic. That doesn't mean you can't interact with us. You can definitely pose any questions you have in the chat during the webinar as you find them coming up, and we will take them in the discussion, and because the editors are also in the chat, maybe they can answer them as we go. Should you not have done so yet, it is possible to download the paper at mydata.org/operators. So please do so if you haven't. And lastly, I would also like to note that this webinar is being recorded, so we can share it with others who are unable to attend today. All right then, yeah, with that, it's time to dive in, and I will pass the ball to Antti Poikula, who will explain more about MyData and how the paper was realized.
Okay, hi. So my name is Antti Jogi Poikula. I'm Vice Chair of MyData Global and also one of the co-leaders of this MyData Operators thematic group, which is behind of this paper that was recently published. Just a word about MyData Global for those of you who are not so familiar. I see many familiar faces, but it's good to rinse and repeat, so that you can also repeat to your colleagues, so pay attention. MyData Global is a non-profit organization that has close to 600 members, including 70 organizations, and members are coming from all over the world. We have currently more than 50 countries presented in the membership, so it's truly, as the name says, a global organization, and we have more formal activity happening in 20 local hubs, which are in this map here. They spread from Silicon Valley to Japan, and from Brazil to Cameroon and Europe. Most of the local hubs are in Europe, and also it's possible for you to set up a hub. So if you want to find like-minded people to push forward in MyData area, in your local area, you can be in touch with MyData Global. So besides the thematic groups, besides the hubs, we have 4 thematic groups. And one of the 4 is this MyData Operators. So it is a group that was established it started its work last year before the MyData 2019 conference, which was in Helsinki last year. There was a group of people who had read very carefully the MyData Declaration and pointed out that there is this prominent position of MyData Operator that had not been described so well earlier. So that group was established first to run a session in the conference, and later on it was formalized as one of the thematic groups in MyData Global. The others, for your information, is a new governance thematic group, health data thematic group, and design thematic group. So recommend checking those out. So in this paper that you hopefully have downloaded already, if not read yet, it was really collaborative work of many people in this thematic group. So in the end, 34 people were named as contributors who actively participated in commenting the text and providing insights in several of the discussions and workshops and so forth. And probably there are also many anonymous commentators that are not counted in But this is just for your information that as it has 5 names in the cover of the paper, we are the editors. We are not the authors. We definitely made the distinction that this is collaborative work of many, and we did, of course, we did hard work in editing, but it's still a collaborative effort. And about MyData, so it's a human-centric idea of personal data management. Organizations and initiatives are independently converging towards similar ideas about personal data infrastructure, management, and governance, where the people themselves would be in the driver's seat regarding the use and sharing of data from them and about them. So this is a chapter from the white paper, and this describes the point that MyData as an organization has not invented anything new to the world if you go forward. So MyData is actually bringing together many of the initiatives and organizations that are looking forward to put people into the control of their personal data. So we strive for a fair, sustainable, and prosperous digital society through human-centric approach to personal data. And we want that people get value from their data and set the agenda on how it is used. And at the same time, for organizations, the ethical use of data should be always the most attractive option. And if you go to mydata.org/declaration, you can find a foundational paper of MyData where the operator idea was also first presented. So there we have kind of 3 big shifts that MyData Global strives for. So it's we want to move from formal to actionable rights. So for example, in legislations like European General Data Protection Regulation, there are many rights for the people, but it doesn't help if there is no tools and practices that could make those rights live in people's world. And the second big shift is that we want to move from the paradigm where from data protection only to a situation where people are empowered to use and get benefit from their data. So we think that we need to have good data protection, but we can climb up from that towards the situation where people can also benefit from their personal data. And as a third one, which is super important for the operator thinking, is that we want to move from closed ecosystems to open ecosystems where different kind of services are interoperable and even substitutable. So this is basically a visualization of the second point, that we see that there should be a use of personal data. So it's not a bad thing that personal data is used. MyData is very much proactive towards usage of data, but it should always be from the perspective of individual being in the charge and therefore climbing up from data protection. And now, actually, I will pass it to Josh Langford.
Thank you, Yogi. So to start the introduction, I'm going to take a step back and put the MyData operators in the context of what we're aiming to achieve and to give some history of this approach. The overall aim, as Yogi has set out, is to empower individuals by letting data flow under their control. And so on the slide here on the left, we have, we could say, the developer alone approach, using disparate APIs to pull together data from multiple sources to do multiple jobs. The access is all there, but it's not scalable, and it requires specialist skills. Then in the center, we have the approach which is currently dominant, where services are integrated along the value chain, but there's very little control for the individual. Finally, on the right, we have the approach that we are talking about today under the MyData operators umbrella. And it uses a high level of interoperability between services to achieve both the simple flow of data and high levels of control for the person. And later in the presentation, Will is going to pick up on this theme of interoperability again. MyData operators are a type of intermediary, and there is extensive literature and practice in this area going back for over 20 years. They take many forms and they have many names. I'm just picking up a few of examples from the slide here that's from the report. Names such as intermediaries, VRM tools, personal information management systems or PIMs, information fiduciaries, mediators of individual data, information banks, and most recently, personal data spaces as set out in the European Commission's data strategy published earlier this year. So there's a strong history here. And now I'm going to move on to look a little bit more at these personal data flows in detail. Here's a simple visualization of the predominant current situation for the use of personal data. Services are fully integrated along the value chain, and a single organization normally manages that entire value chain. This makes it very difficult for individuals to integrate data about them in the world that exists. The MyData vision takes us to a future where these chains are disaggregated to allow specialisms for different parts of the value chain. Unbundling these services allows the individual to choose between different elements rather than being locked into a single package. The individual becomes central to the management of data about them rather than just the originator of the data or the provider of permissions to use the data. And all this is facilitated by the operator, shown here in orange. We can go one step deeper. And here we see the individual as a person who can have multiple operators working on their behalf. The operators provide the infrastructure and the tools for the person in this human-centric ecosystem. They enable the person to securely access, manage, and use the personal data about them, as well as to control the flow of personal data between the data sources and the data using services. So the data sources, which are shown here on the bottom left, they're responsible for collecting, storing, and controlling personal data, which persons, operators, and the data using services may wish to access and use. The data using services down here on the right are responsible for processing personal data from one or more sources to deliver a service which then delivers a benefit to the person. And then within the ecosystem as a whole, there is a role for governance, with organizations responsible for managing, developing, and enforcing a framework of governance. So that's the conceptual view. If we move on a slide, we can now talk about how this is happening in practice. For the purposes of this paper, we've adopted the name Proto operator to describe those organizations that are already working in the way that I've just described. For the paper, we approached organizations that we knew could qualify as Proto operators. We requested them to read and comment on the paper draft and subsequently indicate if they wish to be included as Proto operators in the final version. We can see that over the last 6 months, up to the publication of the paper, we've engaged with 48 Proto operators from 15 different countries, and the number is still growing. They've allowed us to understand the real world practice and the current state of art. So all the materials that you see today have been made possible by their work and their contribution to this process. So let's have a look at these Proto operators in a bit more detail. So there they all are. Thank you. So our first important message to all the Proto operators who've contributed. And this paper brings together examples from many countries and many sectors. Some allow you to take a digital identity from one company to another without needing to duplicate all the paperwork. Others allow you to set up your browsing consents or preferences just once and have them applied everywhere for you. There are some that help you get work and training more easily by making skills profiles and certificates instantly visible on your command. Some function across sectors at a local level, allowing data to move, with your permission, between organizations to improve public services and transport. Finally, many streamline the transfer of data, such as healthcare data, to give you more choices about how and from whom you get services. For example, something as simple as where your prescription is delivered. So at this point, I'm going to transfer you over to Will, who's going to talk about the results from studying and working alongside these Proto operators.
Yeah, thank you, Jos. Yeah, my name is Will Jansen. I'm from Innovalor, and I'm glad that I can talk a bit about the results that we achieved together with all the authors when working on this white paper. And there are 4 things that I would like to briefly go into in about 10 minutes. One, it's the reference model that we created, or developed or used in this paper. Then the goal that we want to achieve, which is a growing interoperability in the field to create a better market, and two other aspects that are very important as well: the governance of the whole ecosystem and the business models that underlie it. So let me first go to the reference model, and well, reference model sometimes seems a bit boring, maybe even a bit controversial, but the most important thing is that we need a common language. We've seen over the last few years there's a lot of misunderstanding in the field on what actually the operator is doing, or how roles are distributed in the ecosystem. And in order to create less misunderstanding, to get a better understanding, we need a common language. You need to be able to understand each other, because if you don't understand each other, we can never move towards an open ecosystem. The reference model basically sets up our language that we can use to discuss with each other what we are doing and how different operators overlap or might differ. What the MyData operator reference model describes are 9 functional elements of operators. And these elements affect how easy it is to utilize the personal data, how transparent and human-centric the utilization of personal data is, and how well the infrastructure supports open competition. And it's good to stress that it's this descriptive model. It's not a normative model. We do not say yet what is good or what is bad. We try to understand the world of the Proto operators in order to understand what we are actually talking about. In the next slide, we show how we created this model, because well, there can be many different models, and there's not the ultimate model or the best model or whatever. What we did is we created in a number of iterations this model, also working with the Proto operators, and that is work that has happened over not only over the last 6 months, but also in the years before that. And it describes the functional elements that are specifically relevant to the operators. It allows you to make a distinction between operators, and it also show where the value is to the person, to the individual. And it's very important to note that not every operator has the same functional elements, and some operators focus on managing permissions in the ecosystem. Some focus on handling data, translating data, or storing data. So it's not a template that you need to fill completely in order to be an operator. You can choose your battle within that reference model. What are those 9 functional elements then? In this picture, we show them. On the left-hand side, identity management and permission management, and that focuses on the participants and the permissions in the ecosystem. The second block, the gray-colored functional elements, are about the services and the value in the system. So I'll briefly talk about what they are. And the blue ones are about data and the meaning of data. And they're covered or placed in context by 2 additional building blocks that I'll briefly describe later on. Identity management, permission management is about who actually is in the ecosystem, who's the person, who's the individual. And it covers things like self-sovereign identities, but also in terms of permission management, who is allowed to use what data at what instance or for how long. Typically these kind of functionalities. In service management, it's about who the data sources and data using services are that exist in the ecosystem and where to find them. You can also talk about when are you allowed to use them and how you can use them, how you can access them. The value exchange is about defining how actually value is exchanged, and that need not only be monetary value, it can also be other types of value, like in peer-to-peer or bartering systems. And when talking about data, it's about the data model management, semantics, how do you understand each other, the transfer of data, which is an important aspect of many Proto operators, and sometimes also personal data storage. Some operators operate as a vault or temporarily store data. And the two building blocks around them are governance support, that is the functionality that is used to be able to support that you're part of an ecosystem. It talks about well, defining when somebody is allowed in the ecosystem, and also getting functionality to find that person or that data source or that data using services. And logging and accountability is the important building block that is there in order for every operator and every actor in the system to be accountable to what he or she is doing and to create transparency. So these are the 9 building blocks, the 9 functional elements that we have defined. They can be discussed, they can be changed, but these are building blocks that are recognizable by all the Proto operators that have adopted the paper, and that can be used to pinpoint to differences as well to similarities. And those differences and similarities are the starting point for the second aspect. That's the journey of interoperability, because the reference model is not a goal in itself. Our goal in the end is to create a sustainable and vibrant ecosystem, or many maybe ecosystems of operators that are sustainable, and that create a market that where persons can choose between operators, where they can move from one operator to the other, and that's the aspect of interoperability. We use a metaphor of the journey of interoperability in the white paper throughout, and we also lay out its initial roadmap with minimum interoperability criteria for operators, because the operators must always strive to work towards and within open networks. Basically, that's a principle that we feel very strong about. The way forward for operators or for personal data management in general is to work towards open networks and ecosystems. It was also stressed by Yogi in the 3 movements that MyData wants to support. So the journey for interoperability is very important to get towards those open networks. And now then, 4 aspects of interoperability, because sometimes it's a bit of an abstract term, interoperability. One thing about interoperability is interoperability in the level of transparency and usability that the operator uses. So how do you show how it works? How do you show what the functional elements are? And how do you also create usability in a similar way throughout the ecosystem? It doesn't mean that everything is the same, but you can focus on different aspects of usability that are crucial for the adoption of operators. The second element of interoperability is the interface for the personal data, how to get data into the ecosystem from the data source to the operator, and from the operator to the data using service, or directly from the data source to the data using service. And the other thing about interoperability is that we want to create enhanced roaming possibilities. You must be able to combine different solutions to move your data from one solution to another, and also, as is mentioned in the 4th bullet, it's to create substitutability. It need not be the case. It should not be the case that you're bound to a certain operator because that operator dominates the market to such an extent that there's nothing to choose anymore. As Josh showed in the old picture, or the picture of the old, so to speak, the old economy, we want to create a real market where there's something to choose for the person. And that also, it's not only about choosing, but it's also about being able to choose within an ecosystem that satisfies or that complies to the MyData principle. And then we move to the element of governance in the ecosystem. Because an operator in itself with a certain functionality, it doesn't operate in itself, as was mentioned earlier. It operates within an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is not automatically well formed. Does not automatically behave well, or it does not automatically comply to the principles that we want to adhere. Balanced and fair relationships between people and organizations do not emerge automatically in personal data ecosystems. There needs to be some explicit methods for human-centric governance to guarantee that MyData principles are followed. And we see that already in many examples of Proto operators. A number of principles that are formulated in a governance framework, and those principles guide the way the different operators collaborate, or the way data sources, data using services, and different actors collaborate. And the governance framework helps in getting the whole ecosystem accepted, and also getting trust into the ecosystem. And that's why sometimes also governance is also called, the governance frameworks are often also called trust frameworks. Like, for example, in telecom, we have great governance frameworks that allow you to move with your cell phone from one operator to another, telecom operator in this case, and it creates a seamless user experience, which is great for cell phones and phone calls to be accepted. So a similar thing needs to be realized in this context. And it's realized at different levels, as is shown in the next picture. We have 3 tiers of governance. In the middle, we have, in the center, we have the picture that you saw earlier. And it's about the ecosystem where the operators have a responsibility towards the individual, where different data sources and data using services can collaborate. So we have, at that ecosystem level, we need governance and a governance framework. And there are many governance frameworks that are already growing within different countries, or within different regions, or within different application areas. For example, in the medical area, the finance area, and so on. And all of these governance frameworks is not in itself, but they are always rooted in legislation. They have to comply to GDPR. They have to comply to certain health legislation. So depending on the context of the ecosystem, the governance framework in itself has to comply to the legislation, of course. And that brings us to a last aspect of the paper and of the model and the journey that we have about the business model. It's a topic that is it's maybe a bit more in its infancy, because when we talk about business models, people often think about the way you earn money, and that need not be the case. But it needs to be transparent in any ecosystem, or any sustainable ecosystem, how actually value is generated and distributed throughout the system and throughout the ecosystem. So it's not the case that we want to prescribe or preclude certain business models at this stage. There may be business models where it's good to make money from personal data under certain prerequisites. There are also many business models that are not based on earning money, but maybe on more societal value. So the data models that we talk about are not prescriptive, they are descriptive. And the one thing that we want to have in our journey towards interoperability, as is shown in the next slide, is that in the long run, if true interoperability between the operators is expected, there needs to be some convergence on the business model. So they are compatible at the ecosystem level, and flows of revenue must be visible in the same way as data flows are to the individual. You've seen a lot of research that transparency on the business model level is as crucial as transparency on the data flow level to create trust as well as to create sustainability. So the business model next to the governance framework as well as the reference model are important aspects of the paper and important elements of the journey that we want to follow now to create indeed a sustainable and MyData compliant ecosystem, or many ecosystems of personal data operators. And it's here that I would like to hand to Yogi to talk a bit about what our next steps are and what we envision with the basis that we've laid out now in the white paper.
So I'm going to tell you quickly about the next steps. What's happening now after we got the paper published. So as a summary, we recognize that interoperability is a journey where every step has positive impact for people and service providers. And our ambition is that this paper, supported by the existing Proto operators, is the first step on this journey. And that many more organizations will join to shape the future work needed. So this paper is really a call for action to all of those who are building these services to make them interoperable in the future. It will take time, but step by step we will get there. So in this paper, as Will nicely explain the content, so to recap everything that is related to how you actually define what is a MyData operator. So that's the aim here, so that we know what is MyData operator and what is not. And in the paper, we laid out minimum requirements to be considered a MyData operator. And these are so that these now Proto operators describe the systems for personal data management with respect to the reference model that was explained in the paper. So using the same terminology. And the other one was that these MyData operators have to demonstrate alignment with MyData principles. So that's kind of the first step in the good governance of these data sharing ecosystems. And the third point is that the operator business models have to satisfy the criteria of transparency and that the person is the primary beneficiary. And of course, these are still on rather high level. I will go next to those, but before that, these are the initial criteria. So we expect that 1 year from now or 2 years from now, these are going to be elevated to next level. So the criteria will evolve while the whole field of operators evolve. Now, as the very next steps, we have defined that our aim is that we can announce to the world the first MyData operators in late June this year. So in a little bit more than 1 month. And you see that out of those 48 organizations that were mentioned as Proto operators in the paper, so far, more than 30 have actually signed a memorandum of understanding about working together for interoperability in the future. And with those who have signed the MOU, you can still sign if you wish. We have created a discussion channel to develop further from those high-level criteria as how to describe. So if there is the question that Proto operators should describe their services in terms of the reference model. So we are just now developing the questionnaires to do so. And we have bi-weekly open calls. So next week's Wednesday, 27th, 4 p.m. CET is the next one. And then we are having an online workshop in early June. We had actually very, very successful workshop for the paper. We were supposed to meet in Amsterdam in face-to-face in March, but that was just when the COVID-19 started to roll over Europe, and we had to, on the fly, move the face-to-face meeting to online meeting, and we were all kind of very disappointed that, oh my God, we have to meet online. But actually it was very successful, and it was a good way to engage people from different corners of the world. So now we are repeating hopefully the same level of engagement and success, not anymore doing for the paper, but defining the criteria more clearly of the operators. And that workshop should result on the final version of the self-description questionnaire, so that we ask from the operators how they fulfill those minimum criteria, and we develop also the mechanism of reviewing those, whether there is some sort of peer review or how we do it, so that it is fair and just. And this thematic group, MyData Operators thematic group, is going to submit a charter for MyData Global board, so that we would have actually the mandate to give the title of MyData Operators for those who deserve it. So that's the process of getting from Proto operators to actual MyData operators in very soon. And of course, this is not the goal. It's not the goal that we can have a bunch of organizations that are called MyData operators. The real goal is really what the operators do and how they develop the interoperability in the future. So that's in short the next steps, and I think it's time to get questions.
Yeah, thank you, Antti, Jos, and Will for this this very great overview. So yeah, I wanted to give some space to people that want to, you know, as regards to the presentation or things you've read in the white paper. Feel free to ask right now. We have about 15 minutes for that. I was hoping to pick up some questions in the chat, but there weren't many. So either that means we did very well on explaining, or yeah, we've all been a little bit quiet. So alternatively, if you have a question, you're also free to unmute yourself and just ask us just straight away.
Hello, do you hear me?
Hi, we hear you. Yes.
Yes, I'm Juan Dura from Institute from Spain. Please, could you repeat? For me, it was not clear. If somebody wants to join this group of people that is working in defining MyData operators, what are the steps to join the group?
Yeah, I can probably pick that up. So first step is to get in touch one of the editors of the paper, so myself or Jos or Will or Malis or Vivi. So you can probably, I can share my contact information for you in the chat. So we communicate in MyData Global Slack channel. So that would be, it's not a requirement for an operator to be in Slack, but that would be definitely very helpful. And then join one of the open calls. And if your organization is actually doing this kind of operator service, then you can also sign the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, to collaborate, and that's a very simple memorandum of understanding, so it doesn't have any super binding legal text, but it's still a strong commitment towards the interoperability. So I'll share you my contact information in channel, Slack, or this comments channel here.
Great, thank you.
All right, anyone else?
There was a question just in the chat there from Chris around examples of explicit methods for human-centric governance to guarantee that MyData principles are followed. I suspect Will probably has more examples about those than I do, but I did just thought it was useful just to pick apart the difference between some of the explicit methods and the implicit methods. So what we do recognize, and in the paper, that there are social norms that are developing slowly around how this data, personal data, is managed within these ecosystems. But those social norms don't leave us with room for enforceability. And so the opportunity for explicit methods of governance give us enforceable routes that sit under the level of global or national, jurisdictional law. And so it's this interplay between national laws, social norms, that there is this opportunity for explicit methods. And I saw already there's some work already that's just been posted in the chat there about some of the 6G research that's ongoing in that area. And there are a couple of people that we study within the Proto operators that are already doing quite a bit of this work. I don't know, Will, if you've got a moment to mention a few of those.
Yeah, in the field of the governance frameworks or the trust frameworks, we see quite some things happening, and they kind of depend on the context also of the application. So you could distinguish between general MyData principles in the governance framework, and then for example, you have to address the fact that it is indeed human-centric, and it's not. So it's person-centric. So the person really needs to be in the center of the government framework. You can make that explicit. It's not a framework which is dominated, for example, by data suppliers or by data using services, which is the case in many, let's say, in the GAFA frameworks. The data using services are the dominant party. You could see that also in their governance, in their frameworks, in their legal context. Another thing that you you could think about also is going a step further than the basic privacy requirements, especially, for example, in the field of transparency and transparency and permissions. So, for example, we can work towards a joint understanding of what we require of transparency, for example, in data exchange, how to show what data is exchanged and with whom. So we can agree in this process on the type of rules and the type of structures, or even the type of process that we would appreciate become explicit in the governance frameworks to create real trust and real transparency associated with MyData and the MyData so-called approved operator eventually.
Thank you, Will. I see an interesting question from Dan Russell about the business model of operators. There are existing platform operators that already have very successful business models. How do you expect them to support and conform to the MyData model when it radically reduces their opportunity to profit? Is it not more likely that they will fight this proposition?
I can pick that one. So it's definitely a big question what Google or Facebook or some others do in this domain. Our understanding is that the current models, however profitable they are still limited in many ways on the how accurate data you can get, and they are mostly built for other purposes. They might serve, for example, the ad business, but they don't serve making the data actionable in many other ways. So we see that the MyData operator model supports different kind of data use, and realistically, these are probably going to live side by side quite a bit, and the future depends on many other ways. So it is possible that these big ones might either try to conform, and they might come and knock on our doors that can be certified as MyData operator in one day. When we see that day, we are probably much more advanced than we are now. Other thing is that they might fight back if there is clear conflict of interest and their business declining, but we don't see that as the relevant debate right now, even though the question pops up every now and then. So we can live side by side.
And to add a bit to that, maybe sometimes it's seen as the sustainable business model or a profitable business model, and MyData principle sometimes seems as a paradox, but I don't think it's a paradox. It's not a contradiction. It is possible to create profitable business models on using data in many different ways, but some are indeed very opaque or misuse data or are not person-centric. And our goal is to create transparency on the business model, and from there on be able to kind of discuss about what are the business models that we want to promote in ecosystems or in governance frameworks, because they really are person-centric, are create an actionable position for the person, and so on. So it's not the case that the business model cannot be profitable. There are many business models that are, but there are also many use cases where profit is hard to make. For example, in a more societal context, when fighting debt with people that are in difficult circumstances in the social domain, and so on. So it's really about checking the prerequisites for business models that we want to promote and want to make explicit and want to learn from in terms of, let's say, create certain patterns of business models that you can use if you want to create a MyData compliant operator.
Thank you, Willem. Antti, I see another interesting next question from Bart. To what extent do you believe governments should be a driving force in realizing ecosystems, especially in terms of governance?
I could maybe pick this one and also the next one, and then we have one more short commentary presentation coming from City of Helsinki. So just to keep eye on our timing. So Mikko Rusano from City of Helsinki promised to give a shout out what they are doing. So it's also related to this, although city is not a government, but still it's a institution. But let me answer first to this question before I give the floor for you. So in the paper part of the governance, we saw it in different levels. So the outermost level is the law and regulations that are set out by the governments or regions or jurisdictions. So that's a binding for everybody, whether they are MyData operators or not. And then to make one step further, more specific to personal data, there is the level of governance of these data sharing ecosystems, where there are data sources, data using services, and operators involved and people. So there might be different kind of governance rules there, and we recognize that there needs to be some sort of governance bodies involved in these ecosystems. And then the innermost level of imposing rules on how to do it can be done by the operator. And that was the starting point of this paper. Why we see operators so crucial is that they are actually providing the infrastructure for data sharing and governance management, so they can practically set the limits, what is possible and what is not. So we see that governments have a role, but we are not dependent on only what governments do. We can still put these MyData principles supporting governance in different levels. And then I very quickly reply to Chris Lee that DIDs and OpenID are something that are, of course, a lot in the discussions. In this paper right now, we took the approach that we didn't mention any technology or standard at all. And that doesn't mean that we would not know about what's going on in the world, quite the opposite. But all of the Proto operators, they have developed, and many of them are looking at the DIDs. But the next step is that we are actually asking what kind of identity technologies you are using or looking at, and we compile and start moving towards interoperability there by giving good recommendations. But not, right now, we haven't done anything of that, so it's too early. Now I think it's time to maybe give the floor for Mikko.
Okay, hi everybody. Great to be here with you. We have been long collaborating with MyData and Antti, and we have pretty ambitious digital strategy. I mean, big theme is how we as a city transform from reactive to proactive city, and this should happen at people's terms. So implementing MyData principles in practice and implementing MyData operator capabilities is really in the heart of our digital strategy. And now we have been got a state funding, 2.25 million euros, and we collaborate with City of Espoo, Turku, and Oulu on implementing these MyData operator capabilities in close collaboration with MyData Global. So I think this paper is important step towards understanding what operator is, how these operators interoperate, and so I'm really excited about the kind of funding and this chance to cooperate with other major cities in Finland. And I think this has a role in also shaping the kind of EU level work and legislation, I hope. Regarding this project, we are also going to open an RFI, request for information, on how these operator capabilities should be implemented. I just want to let you know about this kind of project, and I don't know if Jussi Vehviläinen from Helsinki is in this call too. If you have any further questions, unfortunately I have to jump out very soon, and but as said, work is starting, and we are closely working with MyData Global on this. So that's my briefing, short briefing about what we're up to here in Helsinki.
Thanks. So City of Helsinki got more than 2 million euros to work with other cities to do MyData operators. So that's a big thing.
Unique opportunity, I would say.
It seems that we have actually 5 minutes of time to spare, which is quite a bit, because we thought yesterday that we would definitely run over. So we actually do have yeah, we actually do have some time for more questions. I see some. Let's see. Paul Wang has more questions to follow up on the governance question. Would there be an interest to empower governments to drive more in terms of governance?
Yeah, so I think the example that Mika just gave is already a good example of that. So trying to learn what the role of cities is in the operator in the operator scene, as is mentioned. And I think it's definitely interesting to collaborate with governments worldwide in creating governance frameworks, both in two ways. There's already a lot that can be learned from the things that governments have tried or have done or have realized in different regions. Also learning about the cultural differences in different regions of the world. And the other way around, creating best practices of what a typical governance framework could be, aiming at health situations, aiming at social situations, or what type of self-regulation could be, for example, also promoted towards, for example, applications in the financial services. So yeah, they're definitely interested to collaborate on, and I think we should invite more governmental agencies also to this community, because I think they're not that very much present now here.
Yeah. To talk about government, there's also the EU data strategy, and a great question from Dixon about that. Do we have any comments regarding the EU data strategy and the MyData operator models? I see, Antti, that you would like to comment here.
Yes, I can quickly comment on that. So MyData was explicitly mentioned in the EU data strategy that got published a couple of months ago. And there were other interesting references, for example, that in general data protection regulation, there is an article about data portability. And it was recognized in the data strategy that this data portability is not yet working as well as it should be, and it may be enhanced, the legislation. And then one more important point was that there was recognized the existence of these data intermediaries, which MyData operators would be also. And following examples from some other parts of the world, namely Japan, there is an idea that maybe these data intermediaries should be certified against some criteria to create better working markets and trust towards these intermediaries. And this would be then part of the governance bit for the common European data spaces. And that's common European data spaces. That's the keyword for finding out what the European Commission is thinking around these topics. So, and MyData Global, we are very much involved. We are in connection with the Commission, and also giving out our own replies to the requests from comment the Commission papers. Lately, I just heard that there was very strong emphasis on human centricity in the data strategy and other related papers, but now it's on the comment round for the member states, the different countries, and there has been some sort of crossing over the human centricity part, and it's like going back to the data economy without the human centric prefix there, which is in a way pity if it goes to that direction, but MyData Global is there to, of course, support the human centricity. And if anybody is geeky enough to follow the EU things, I'm happy to talk more about what's happening there.
Thank you, Antti. And to round this off, we have, and talking about human centricity, there has been questions coming in also about usability. So on Peter Eikelboom here, we want to be person-centric, so shouldn't we also focus on design, customer journeys, and the usability of the operator? Perhaps starting with sharing best practices and building a common design library. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I just posted actually a line in the chat on that question. I think it's a very good question. Within the report and through this work, we've made a commitment to work with the other thematic groups that Yogi had mentioned at the start of this call. And there is a design thematic group. And we've really just now started to initiate that piece of work to look at usability in more depth. I think it's appropriate that we do that with them. One of the things that comes about by having these multiple groups is that we've got to make sure that we work together when we need to, and that we're not doing each other's work for us. So I think that that's a combined piece of work that should be taken by those two groups together, and that's what we aim to do going forward.
Amazing. So yeah, I would like to round us off then, because it is in fact 4 o'clock. Yeah, so we have perhaps a last round of words from the editors with the last final statements about the operator paper, and what would you like our audience to be doing the coming weeks, months? Can I start with you, Jos?
Of course. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. It's been a great privilege to be involved as a contributor and with the paper. I would just encourage those of you that have been inspired by the idea to recommend it to others. There's plenty of time to read the paper and take the time when you have it. But for the moment, the most important thing is to get the message out of the work that we're trying to do here about how we're working together collaboratively. And that, I think, is the thing that supports us the most.
Thank you, Jos. How about you, Will? Any last words?
Emphasizing the collaborative part. It's really, really great to see so many Proto operators that joined the discussion. And I would like to emphasize that we really need the practical experiences that you have had over the last few years in both on the technical side, on the business model side, as well as on the governance side. It's not about MyData kind of prescribing the way you should behave. It's MyData capturing the experiences and linking them to the MyData principles to support the operators in becoming a great success and really moving forward towards that human-centric vision of personal data management.
Thank you. Antti, the real last word.
last word. Yeah, I couldn't agree more on of the collaborative thing, because I mean, world is full of papers, PDFs, internet is full of PDFs. So what makes I think this paper a little bit more valuable than some other PDFs, is not to be against any other PDFs in general, is that it's live. So it's not the paper itself, but it's really the community of Proto operators and the thematic group people who are super expert in this area and working together. So we have had wonderful discussions, and not always agreeing on everything. So we have had quite a bit of also issues that are not so easy to solve, but this community is really great in debating in good manner and getting to the kind of common understanding to higher level. So it's really, I think, the page 13 of the paper that is for me very much close to my heart. So it's the Proto operators. So thanks for all of you, and it's not too late to join. So as somebody asked how to get on board, now it's a very good time to get on board in this work towards the future. So just be in touch with us.
Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you to the presenters. Thank you to the attendees that were here today. Yeah, we all hope that you've gained a bit more understanding about what the MyData operator does, and that you will join us in the journey towards interoperability. So thank you everyone, and hope to see you all in the Slack or working on the papers and in the working groups.